So I've talked quite a bit about Pfizer on this channel as of late, and that's because it's been in the news, and I think there's a lot of interest around the topic, especially when it comes from an investment standpoint. What I wanted to focus this video on is Pfizer as a dividend investment. I've spoken at length about what I thought about this company as far as its actual valuation, as far as its stock price, and what I saw the stock price going to or maybe not going to. But what I haven't talked about as much is whether this is a good longer term play in terms of dividends. So we'll explore that in this video, so stay tuned. Hey folks, Richard Walls here, helping you with career development and personal finance. And if those two topics are of interest to you, do make sure to subscribe to this channel down below and hit the notification bell next to that so you can get notified of when I post new content. And of course, if you happen to like what you see, it'd be a huge favor to me and my channel if you hit that like button down below. So with that said, let's get to it. So if you've seen any of my recent videos on Pfizer, you'll know that I talked about it from the angle of the stock price and from the context, or within the context rather, of the vaccine approvals and what that has done to the stock price, or maybe what it hasn't done to the stock price. And there's a lot of investors out there, especially first-time investors, that are seeing these news headlines and thinking they can get ahead of the price of the stock in hopes that the stock price will increase and they can make an exit and, of course, profit. I've mentioned a lot in previous videos where I wasn't quite sure that was going to happen, and of course we've seen the stock price decrease since the news of the FDA approval. But I've also made mention that in terms of a long-term investment, which is what I recommend for most people trying to do short-term trades, is going to be fairly difficult, especially when you have to time it, and if you're just a casual investor, maybe not the best route. But as a long-term play, I'd mentioned I wouldn't say many times, but I've mentioned once or twice that this is not a bad idea to have as part of a more comprehensive and complete portfolio. And this would be, in my opinion, something you'd consider as an income investment or a dividend investment. So let's go to my screen and I'll show you exactly what I'm talking about and put this in relation to other pharmaceutical companies. So for starters, here we're looking at Pfizer and the stock price, and you see that decline. Just to recap very fast what I think of the stock price, it has a ceiling. If you look at the history, the highest it's ever been, and this is the early 2000s, was around I got the S&P 500 index in there, but the highest it's ever been was around $45 and change. To think that it's going to go past that based on its history, it's fairly unlikely. Of course, it can certainly happen. I'm not going to discount that entirely, but unlikely to happen, even with the news of the vaccine. So that's something I'm not really counting on. Now, I'm not personally invested in Pfizer. I'm just observing here, and I have invested in biotech before, still am, but just to give you some context here, that's what we're looking at in terms of stock price. So again, if you're buying that for growth, you might be a little bit disappointed, especially at this point in time. But you will notice that the dividend yield is actually not too bad. At least at this point in time, it's around 4.17%, which is not bad at all. And I actually came across this one very handy website called Dividend.com. As you might imagine, they talk about dividends. And in this case, I filtered down to pharmaceutical companies, especially large pharma. And so we've got J&J, we've got Pfizer, Novartis, Merck, Eli Lilly, and a few other stocks in here as well. And I think this might be a little bit out of date, but we'll go with it because this is all in relation to one another. And here you can see where Pfizer stacks up. At least at this point in time, it's 3%. I believe that's when, well, that's interesting. It's a little bit different. But nonetheless, just look at this from the standpoint of comparison. You'll see where Pfizer stacks up. Pfizer is more or less middle of the pack. You have some that are a little bit higher, some quite a bit higher, and some a little bit lower. So as far as dividend yield, it's fine. It's pretty okay. Nothing to get too excited about, but just as a comparison, if we look at the treasury yield, which if you're a new investor, this would be considered one of the safest investments, at least at this point in time. And you'll see some of the yields here, which for 30-year notes go, north of 1%. So getting closer to 2%. This has been very low in recent years. So again, the dividend yield should be higher. So that's not going to be too big of a surprise. And then if we look at another, I would consider a safe investment or safe, I wouldn't call it an investment, it's a savings account. But some of the yields for some of the higher yield savings accounts, you're looking at 0.5 to 0.66%. Some of these banks I actually haven't heard of. I tend to look at Ally, which generally or historically had some of the highest yields in the market. That has declined quite a bit with the US interest rates declining quite a bit in the past year and even in years prior. So again, you're not going to be making a whole lot here. So whenever you look at a income investment, Pfizer I would consider as good as any other pharmaceutical company. I'm not gonna, if I were you, I wouldn't put all my bets on Pfizer, but as part of a more comprehensive portfolio, it certainly looks fine to me. It looks as good as any other large pharmaceutical company here. Now, of course, from a stock price or value standpoint, there might be some better options, of course, from a dividend standpoint, but also value. I haven't gone into tons of detail on Eli Lilly or GlaxoSmithKline. But nonetheless, when you think of this, I tend to think of these in terms of your ExxonMobils and your Chevron, Shell. When I think of those big oil and gas companies, if you were to invest in any one of those, chances are you'll be okay. And of course, that's a bad example now because oil and gas has been impacted quite a bit this year. But nonetheless, whenever you look at some of the larger companies in a certain industry, it's a relatively safe bet. Of course, everything can hit the fan. Pfizer can go bankrupt in a year. Who knows? A lot of things can happen, right? Of course, this, year 2020, a lot of crazy things have happened. So can't discount anything, but just know that if you're looking at some of these large pharmaceutical companies, you're in a relatively safe position. The only thing that I could see being a major deterrent or decelerator or have any kind of major negative impact would be if from a vaccine standpoint, if, again, I mentioned this in other videos, but if the challenges, the logistical challenges or manufacturing challenges become so much so that it actually impacts them from a P&L standpoint, then that might be something that has a negative impact on their stock. It could come out later, scandals have rocked certain companies before, so I'm not anticipating anything here, but a lot can happen. So all that to say is, if you're looking at this from a long-term income standpoint, it's about as good as any other major pharmaceutical company out there. Again, so long as this is not your only investment and you're hoping that this is going to be your golden ticket, because it's certainly not going to be the case. I've always advocated for a well-rounded portfolio and a portfolio that's diversified, not just across different industries, but within industries across various companies. And of course, take it a step further, I advocate for index funds. So that gives you all the diversification you could ever want. But if you're making picks here, Pfizer would be an option, if you should so choose, as an income investment or an income stock, not so much a growth stock. So folks, hope that puts it into a little bit more context how this stacks up with maybe other pharmaceutical companies, some of which you might be maybe more interested in looking into because you might find better value in terms of stock price and growth trajectory. But hope that helps and gives a little bit more context. Let me know in the comments, down below what you think of this from an investment standpoint, or rather from an income investment standpoint. I'd love to hear your comments and have a dialogue. So thank you for watching, and I'll see you around.